Welcome back to the School of Muscle. Today I'm joined by Mac Nutrition, certified nutritionist, and expert fitness coach, Jordan Lips. Jordan, thanks for coming on today.
I'm happy to be here, man. Good to chat with you. We haven't chatted in a while. It should be a fun one.
I know, it's been a minute. Today's the game plan. We're going to try to focus on mistakes people make before they enter a fat loss phase, then get into some mistakes that people make during a fat loss phase, and then some mistakes people make after fat loss phase. So I think a good place for us to start here is, what are kind of some of those main mistakes that you see people make before they even start a fat loss phase?
Yeah, this is something that maybe if you had asked me a couple of years ago, I might have changed my opinion, my thought a little bit on. But something I've been thinking about a lot is looking at the individual, and again, if you are the individual, assessing yourself as to what sort of fat loss are we talking about? Is this a get healthy, stay healthy client? Is this I'm at an unhealthy body fat range I've struggled with for my whole life, maintaining my body weight, and I'm really I from a health perspective, I'm looking to get healthy, stay healthy, or is this cyclical dieting? And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean, is this intentional cyclical dieting for a net body composition within a healthy body weight range the entire time? Not actually talking about a get healthy, stay healthy crowd. And I would say if we plot those two things on a spectrum of on the left side of that spectrum would be a get healthy, stay healthy, Gen Pop. I've been struggling with this for my life and I'd like to get healthy, versus on the right, elite bodybuilder. I think the more we move to the Gen Pop side of things, the more we have to start doing a lot of this pre-work of how am I going to sustain this forever? And when I'm prepping for what I'm going to do in that fat loss phase, or how I'm going to adhere to a deficit, how I'm going to make some of these changes, to have a real continuous emphasis and recognition of this being forever. And almost to kind of narrow it down in a bit of a myopic reductionist way, the things that you should do if you are more of a Gen Pop client, more of a get healthy, stay healthy, vast majority of people, is do more of this work on the front end. We can be specific about what that means, but also do less things that you won't want to do forever. So if you're an elite level bodybuilder, we move to the right side of that spectrum. I believe it's very fine for you to go into a fat loss phase and do things that are inherently unsustainable. You're I'm only doing this for this fat loss phase. I don't want to ever do this again, or I don't want to do this thing in this magnitude for the long term. And you're okay with that because of the nature of, one, potentially who you are, personality traits, but also kind of the context of this person losing fat for, net body composition change, staying very lean, relatively more concerned with not a get healthy, stay healthy client. But I think the more we are talking about that get healthy, stay healthy client, the more I think it's about, I don't want to deviate too far from anything that you think is unsustainable for the long term in a magnitude that you'd be doing it. I don't want you doing, I just got a question in my Q&A this morning. It's how do I taper down steps? Because I was doing 20,000 steps to lose weight, and how do I go down to something that's more sustainable? And it's I wouldn't have wanted you to do that in the first place. I would have rather worked on strategies that didn't call for you doing something that you knew you wouldn't be able to do for the long term. And some of those things would be, thinking about basic, some nutrition education, learning about basic meal composition, learning about the macronutrients a little bit. One thing I think would I don't want to get too grandiose that it would cure obesity. It wouldn't, but building basic a meal around a protein and a plant, and just starting your meal with that is going to just, again, on average, improve nutrition quality, improve protein intake, improve fiber intake, probably decrease caloric intake, and have a ton of really good benefits. And so there are some non-negotiables I've started to kind of incorporate into the way I've been coaching. It's we need to get a protein and a plant on 3 meals per day. We need to get 30 to 40 grams of protein at least in each of those meals. And there's some of these things that we need to do this first, because it's just impossible to think that you're going to sustain this long term without some of these habits. We need to be getting at least 8,000 steps a day. Got to be getting at least 2 strength training, maybe even at least 2 cardio, which is something I'm actually changing my tune about a little bit, the inclusion of intentional cardio potentially. We need to get some of these foundational habits that are just going to make sustaining this easier. I can't imagine that we are going to our sustaining metrics are just so unbelievably abysmal. We're just everyone knows how to lose weight. We have no idea how to sustain it. And so if you're a client, again, on the intentional cyclical dieting side, body comp side, you're doing a photo shoot, or you're just prepping for a show, or you want to get lean for summer, this is a slightly different context where you might be okay doing things hitting cardio 4 times a week, even though you know you don't ever want to do that again when this is over. That's okay. But for most people, I think the we really need to be buckling down on like, this is forever. And so if this is so far against what you could sustain with your life and your job and your kids, 5 times a week lifting, 5 times a week cardio, or whatever it is, going keto, cutting carbohydrates out like entirely, like we really need to be like, and the hard part is that's difficult because a lot of those like going really hard, really fast is going to give you really like very fast return. You'll lose weight very quickly. And so it's a bit of delaying gratification, spending some time working with the client on the front end, building some of these habits, talking about their support system, talking about like their people in their family and in their house and how to navigate those situations. And it ends up being a little bit more difficult because there's more depth to it, because we're really looking at like a big lifestyle and behavior change instead of like, let's calculate your macros and make sure that your maintenance calories are on point, which is all fine. Just, I think, a different context. I think it's an important first question of like, who are we dealing with,
Yep, absolutely. And I think that is well in line with the research on this as well, to where overall long-term fat loss, it's tricky. Like only a small percentage of people actually maintain fat loss. But for the people that do, it seems to be the people that actually make lifestyle changes. So they actually improve their habits when it comes to eating, and they also maintain a higher level of activity after they've lost that weight. So I think that kind of having that kind of lifestyle focused approach is definitely a good thing. And yeah, like you said, depending on the context, if someone's like getting, shredded for a photo shoot or on the stage, those last several weeks of that diet, they're probably going to have to do some unsustainable things. And that's perfectly okay. But at some point, they're probably going to have to come back to a more sustainable approach to maintain that fat loss for the long run. So I'm in total agreement there. And it sounds like some of those lifestyle things that you like to have in place before a deficit are having a good protein and veggie at each meal to kind of start working on that daily protein intake, and also getting plenty of veggies and satiating foods in. And then also lifting weights and maybe also some cardio as well in there.
Yeah, some of the interesting research that I'm like, I just think that if we're dealing with a beginner, and I don't mean that like a day one beginner, it could even be someone who's like lifted in the past a little bit here and there. But I'm sure somebody who comes to you when they get their program from you, it's some combination of some definition of more advanced. It's like better exercise selection with like some amount of an eye on how hard I'm training with form videos. And so the training quality is inevitably going to go up. And so maybe they won't need as much as they previously needed. And just some of the research on appetite suppression, when we look at people who are like sedentary and they become moderately active, we tend to see that shift be from a cardiovascular perspective, like doing cardio, be actually pretty meaningful from an appetite suppression standpoint. Again, in general, I think there's quite a bit of individual difference, but people who are like moderately active, like let's say like 8 to 12,000 steps, we'll say, just like total rough ballpark, like we don't see more appetite suppression. It's like an upside down U-shaped curve where like these people actually start to get hungrier, and like the net hunger to calorie burned equation ends up being not as great. There's like a worse ROI, and eventually it's like, I'm doing so much cardio, I'm even more hungry than the calories I burned from this cardio, and I end up undoing that, or just making this a lot harder on myself at best. And so that's something that I've been feeling a little bit more strongly, is like whether that means getting on the treadmill, or not. Like when I say getting on the treadmill, I just mean like doing concise cardio. I think that importance on appetite suppression is like, I just don't like, physiologically, could you lose weight at 5,000 or 6,000 steps a day? Of course you could. You could just eat less. Like this is a math equation at the absolute most highest level. It just doesn't seem to be practical that way. And so if I have a client who's like, yeah, I can only get 6,000 steps in my normal routine, but I can train 4 days a week, I might be like, yeah, okay, let's take one of those days and let's do some cardio or something to get that net activity across the week maybe a little bit higher. And whatever, I think you could go both ways there, but I do think that that's something I've shifted depending on the time constraints that somebody has, for sure.
Yep. I feel very similar, in which I would say if you asked me 3 or 4 years ago, I would see, I don't see much of a place for cardio in a program. But I think more and more research is coming out. Like you said, cardio can help with satiety, and then research around long-term weight loss. The more active someone is, the more they tend to maintain that lost weight. So there's probably things going on there, like you said, with satiety, also allowing you to diet on a little bit more food that has benefits there. So I definitely think those are good things to have in place. Is there anything else that you like to have in place? So maybe a little bit of cardio, consistent weightlifting, protein, good veggie source at each meal. Anything else that you're looking to have in place before you kind of get started in the fat loss phase?
Yeah, listen, if we're going to track, which is like the initial question, like if we're going to do some form of tracking, which isn't always mandatory for sure, but if we are, then I would actually recommend like I said, like a per meal protein intake, so like at least 30 grams of protein per meal. And I would actually start to track fiber. I think that to me is an indirect benefit here in terms of fat loss. Has a direct benefit on a lot of things in terms of physiological health, but an indirect benefit here in terms of like probably a net increase in volume, net increase in satiety by increasing volume, increasing fiber. And so those tend to be some of the things where it's like, hey, like, not to do like this stupid cliche, but these are like sharpening your axe sort of things. Like if you're eating 30 grams of protein per meal, you're getting 25 grams of fiber per day. The other two that I might say is like being in your bed for 8 hours per night and getting maybe 8,000 steps. Like whether or not that will by itself produce fat loss by a natural reduction in caloric intake and a natural increase in caloric expenditure, which it probably will for a lot of people, but that's not the goal necessarily. Like you are spending time building a car that goes faster instead of wasting time driving a slow one, so that when you get in it, we can actually go and we can get more mileage. We can do this for the long term. And it's difficult because you know this. So you take on a client, it's like, let's get started, man. Like I want to lose fat now. And it's like you'd be probably better off spending 1 to 6 months not focused on fat loss. If it happens, it happens, but building some of this stuff. And it's, people pay a top dollar. They want to like get up. They're motivated. So there's a combination of give you what you want and give you what you need. But I've been pushing a little bit more for this, like, I know that you guys have used like a primer phase as a terminology within like training, but this might be that similar. Like this will potentiate greater results later by whatever. In this case, more practically making things easier for the long run.
Yep, absolutely. I think all those things are definitely good things to have in place. And, if someone doesn't have all those things in place right away when they kind of start trying to lose fat, I think that's totally fine. But definitely all things to continue to work on while you're trying to lose fat. And, most people are, even if they start eating more protein at each meal, eating more fiber, sleeping better, all that, they're probably going to notice fat loss anyways if they're not doing those things. So they're already going to see results with body composition improvement there. So yeah, I think you can kind of pick that low-hanging fruit right away.
I also think that if you go through these things, so let's say like sleep, steps, protein, fiber, water intake, I don't know, workouts, let's say those 5 pillars here. If you go for that and you create a threshold and say, hey, once we're running on all cylinders here, like bringing calories down will be a lot easier, a lot more sustainable. This is all going to be more likely to be successful. What ends up happening is it doesn't always work perfectly. Like it's rare that you get a client who's like, oh, great, 30 grams of protein every meal, plant every meal, 25 grams of fiber, like 8,000. Like you run into an issue somewhere. And actually that's where they've always run into issues. And so what you've done is you've identified the roadblock or this like bottleneck for people where like 3 weeks into trying to get 30 grams of protein per meal, they can't do it. Or they haven't been able to do it at this first attempt. And you're starting to figure out what are the real reasons this person has struggled with fat loss in the past. Like, did they not grow up in a protein-centric household that did they not grow up in a family that cooked a lot and they eat a lot of their meals out, or, they don't have time, they work shift work, or you'll find out where the bottleneck is by doing this. If you just decrease calories, what you end up having is like somebody who's struggling to hit their calories. But then you have to like backtrack and figure out how that's happening. And I'm not saying you can't find success that way, but I actually find that for like, hey, let's not worry about decreasing your calories right now. Can you do these fundamental habits? And which of these for you is the bottleneck? Which of these for you has like an exponentially greater amount of difficulty? That might be, it's like a lot of times it's, there's like a big sleep component where it's like, yeah, I can do all this stuff, but like I sleep 6 hours a night. And I'm like, hey, here is why it hasn't worked in the past and why it won't work in the future. This is where we need to not only by itself focus, but a lot of times the bottleneck, it becomes illuminated when you tackle them from a bit of a principle perspective. These, 5 or 6 things, it's like, which of these are you really struggling with? Because that's what's going to make fat loss harder. That's what's made fat loss harder in the past as well.
Yep. Absolutely like that approach. And like you said, a lot of those things lead to making it hard for someone to stick to their calories. And if you just focus on eating a certain number of calories, then you're making it out to be a lot more difficult than it needs to be, rather than finding these bottlenecks and adjusting them. So I think all those are good things to have in place before starting a diet. But let's transition now into, while someone's dieting, what are some mistakes that you see that people make that prevent them from being able to reach your goals? And my guess is some of it's going to come back to maybe some of these habits and having those in place. But what are some things that you've seen?
Yeah, certainly I would say that your greatest predictor of success in the fat loss phase is like those habits that you either had or have formed in the preamble here. There was something that Eric Trexler was talking about on a recent Stronger by Science podcast. He was talking about satiety, and he was talking about like a philosophy of acceptance. As actually like a tool to manage hunger and satiety, and I will butcher his wonderfully eloquent description, but some element of like understanding that in order to lose fat, like that hunger will be present, and that we can look at it a bit more neutrally, and we can look at it as a part of the process and something that won't always be there, something that you don't always need to avoid, something that you don't always need to like not act upon. It's not like you can never eat, even though it's not like you can ever have a maintenance day because you don't feel good. So I think this element of acceptance, where you're understanding that some of these things you're signing up for it, it's somewhat voluntary. I don't like the rigidly like it's voluntary, you decided to do it, so if it sucks, like suck it up. Like there's some element of let's be real about what this is going to cost in terms of biofeedback changes. Like you might be hungry sometimes. So that kind of adopting a philosophy of acceptance is really important, I think, but also not sugarcoating it to a client. And obviously as a client, as a person, just kind of understanding like this is not linear. You will, even with all of this fun preamble stuff that we talked about, like it will not go perfectly. You will have days that you had a plan that you don't follow. There will be a day that a week you don't lose weight, a week you gain weight, certainly on the day-to-day perspective, things are going to fluctuate. And so I would get rid of this idea that this is a linear process with no obstacles. And again, from an acceptance mindset, accept that those things are going to happen. I would not, again, these are things most people kind of understand in theory, but when they're in it and it's not going well, like it is this moment that is an inflection point of like, oh, this thing didn't go well. Like this is the moment where I can make it different this time, because what I normally would do is I would say, F it, and I'm out of here. I'm going to there goes the whole week, or there goes the whole weekend, or there goes the whole day, or some form of slashing out your other three tires, some sort of like defeatist mentality here. And this is the moment you can make it different this time, is to not do that. And even if it's a little thing, you go out to IHOP and you thought you were going to get an omelet, but instead you got 47 pancakes. Instead of throwing the rest of the day and saying, screw it, I'll just eat whatever I want, and just being like, you know what, okay, it happened. Like I'm going to go back to like my normal meal composition that I know makes me feel good and aids my goals as soon as possible. That might be one meal. It might just be like a very small thing happen on a daily basis, but adopting that mindset of just being able to kind of roll with the punches a little bit and accept that this won't be linear. I don't know about you. I think if we go back to the example of the bodybuilder, more of an intentional body shape and size cycling versus like a Gen Pop, I want to get healthy, stay healthy. Like the use of a timeline is something that I'm really working through right now. Like I think there's on one side of the spectrum an argument for like, hey, let's set a timeline because that external pressure of we want to be done by this date. So let's not, it's like having a test. Like I study better when I know the test is on a certain day. If you told me I could take the test whenever, I might never get it done. And so there is such a thing as positive external pressure, but I have found that also can backfire. So I don't want to make it sound like it's usually one of those. I don't know if it's usually one of those, but certainly I would take a look at the individual and say, are we better off taking a step back from giving you this external pressure if you got to be done by this date, and just be like, hey, we're doing this forever. You lose a quarter pound, half pound. I think that this rate of fat loss is something we talk about, but if you have 3 weeks where you just maintained after 5 weeks of like more reasonable rate of fat loss, like we're not like jumping off a cliff because you have a competition in next month. You might, obviously, but if you're not that person in that circumstance, that I just would at least, as a coach or as a person, acknowledge that the use of external pressure via like a timeline, an end date, might not be helpful. It might be helpful, but it might not be helpful. And so to at least take that into account when you're talking to the individual. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think I can totally see both sides of it, to where it's like we don't necessarily want to drag this fat loss phase out to be, necessarily 2 years long and just perpetually keep you in and out of a deficit the entire time, as there could be negative actual physiological consequences to that. But also, if we have a couple weeks to where your weight doesn't move as much, it's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. And as long as that general trend is downward over an extended period of time, we're going to get to where someone wants to go. So I really like that approach. And I really I listened to Eric Trexler, our Stronger by Science recent podcast with Trexler, and he made really good points on what you just said about, we've been taught for so long to want to avoid hunger, in which during a fat loss phase, we go out of our way to do all these different strategies to just not get hungry. When if we took a different approach of just framing hunger as that is our body telling us we're in a calorie deficit and that we're making progress when we're getting closer to our goals, and it's not necessarily something that's to be avoided and this will pass eventually, then that acceptance just makes things a lot easier, rather than, creating that fear of, I can't get hungry. It's the worst thing ever. So I really like both of those.
I also think that it's a combination of something I think Eric has talked about, but also I had a Abby Langer, wonderful guest if you're looking for a guest, but talking about but while there's a semantic argument here, the difference between satiating or being satiated and being satisfied. And it kind of just rings to our the multifactorial nature of hunger, that we have non-biological drives to eat, we have environmental, psychological drives to eat, and that you could do everything possible to be satiated, but some of those things that you do via food swaps or making your food more bland or more fiber or whatever it is, whatever those strategies are to be more satiated, they might take you away from the other things that make you feel more satisfied. We can take it to the extreme and be you're super orthorexic, totally clean eating, never eating anything that tastes good at all. And you might kind of meet some of the satiety demands that you have physiologically, but there are other reasons that you have sensations of hunger and sensations of drive to eat that will not be satisfied. And so there's probably a balance between making these changes to become satiated, which I think, volume eating, totally. Increasing fiber, protein. Part of the knock-on benefits is because you'll be more satiated. One of the best defenses against hunger is eating more satiating diet, foods that are higher to satiety per calorie. That's a fact. But if you take that so far to the extreme and you forget all the other biological, or in this case, psychological, let's say emotional drives to eat, environmental, you probably won't end up with the highest net satisfaction. And I think that both of those play a part. Most of us aren't great at differentiating between, I'm physiologically hungry and I want to eat. And while it's a cool discussion to have a chat as to how to differentiate, I think that you could do real hunger is when your stomach growls and you could feel it, versus more of an emotional drive. But I'm not so sure that means we should be forgetting about one of those two. And so I think that there's could I have a 400 calorie meal that is, 10 satiety points, but tastes like shit, or 7 satiety points, which totally made up metric, but is more satisfying because it, allowed me to have something that I enjoy, that, psychologically checked a box of I'm not being over restrictive or my relationship with food, or I'm not building up to a binge. And so when Eric was talking about satiety, I think one of the things that I think about is also acknowledging maybe the difference, maybe just semantically, between satisfied and satiated, and that they might be two different things with two different strategies behind how to kind of meet those demands,
Yeah, absolutely. And this actually reminds me of something Alberto Nunez will talk about a little bit when he's in his contest preps, and he'll kind of mention that he can eat all the volume in the world, and he can eat or he can have all these artificially sweetened drinks, but his stomach has expanded and it's technically satiated, but he is not satisfied. At some point during a deficit, you're still in a deficit. You're not really going to meet all of your nutritional requirements, and you're going to still feel a little bit unsatisfied. And I think it comes back to kind of accepting that, hey, this is kind of part of the phase that we're in. When you're in a calorie deficit, it's kind of inherent that there's going to be some unsatisfactory meals and some hunger playing a role here and there.
I don't want to glorify it. I don't want everyone to be this glorifying being hungry and being some martyr where you're celebrating how hungry you are. it's a tricky. This is tricky conversation because you want to acknowledge that it's part of the process and that it's somewhat normal, and you can even go as far as to be like, that's like a sign that it's working. But there is a possibility of becoming like taking that to an nth degree that's not super healthy. But I'm more of wanting to acknowledge that it's real and normal and accept that it exists, and even shifting the perspective to look at it in a certain way that's like, okay, like if I was never, ever, 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 ever hungry, I would place my money that I'm not losing weight, And so that's like something where it's like, yeah, okay, well, if I have a client who's like, I'm not losing weight, I'm like, well, how do you feel? They're like, I feel freaking awesome. I'm like, okay, like maybe I'm not surprised you're not losing weight then, because there's at least a correlation here,
Yep, absolutely. And yeah, I didn't want it to come across as like hunger is necessarily a good thing and that we should be like masochistic about it and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think we covered that pretty well, but now let's transition into mistakes that people make following a diet. So say it's more of like that just general person. Let's say it's not like a contest prep and they went through like, a year of dieting and are really needing to recover from it. Let's say someone just went from like 20% body fat and they made it down to like 12 or 13% and they're super happy with it. This was their goal physique. What are some mistakes that you see people make when they're trying to like come out of that they just finished dieting?
Yeah, I think the easy answer is like, jumping to a calorie amount that's too much and reversing too fast, or, hearing that the industry is all about like, don't reverse at all, just jump right to maintenance. And then you do that, but you jumped too high. And so you spent a month or two in a surplus and you gained some weight back. So first and foremost, that's a mistake that people make. They hear that you don't need to reverse diet at all, which physiologically speaking, if you define reverse dieting in a certain way, I would agree with. Practically, I don't think that becomes, hey, just jump to whatever a calorie calculator says your maintenance is going to be at this new body weight, because in all likelihood, it will be for some time less than that, which means for some time you'll be in a surplus. So that's like that's something that's pretty upper level stuff. I think we both know that like what makes the diet easier beforehand is what you did during the diet, and what you did during diet is made easier by what you did before the diet. So I think all of these things absolutely work together. I actually think that, again, it's the greater gap between what you did to lose weight and what you're going to do to maintain. The greater that gap, the less chance of success. That's not zero, but the less. I'd say there's an inverse correlation in there somewhere. And something else I was going to say was an assumption that you're going to keep all the weight off. I think it's like just an understanding from a perspective of like, if you gain a few pounds that you've done something wrong, and again, perpetuating that kind of effort mentality of like, oh, I'm just screwing this up now, like forget about it. Because I think that even in a perfect scenario, I mean, when I say perfect, I mean, you lose X amount of pounds of fat and you keep X amount of pound of fat off, 100% of that fat, there will have been non-fat pounds that you lost that you will gain back now. Glycogen, water that comes with that, stomach content. So let's not be real. I mean, if you don't gain one single pound from the end of your fat loss phase all the way to a point where you reach beautiful maintenance calories, you feel 100%, you feel unbelievable, and you've gained 0 pounds, and you're like, wow, I've reached this maintenance utopia, I feel amazing. That would be a vast minority in my opinion. The second thing is even a little bit more nihilistic, a little bit more cynical, is that it's possible that there's a recognition of body fat set point. Like here's something that I'll just say, is that you could be at maintenance calories, eating an amount of food that your body requires to keep the lights on, to maintain the activity that you do, and you could still not feel good, and you could still be hungry. And your hunger levels are not perfectly tied to your body shape and size and activity level. They're not perfectly titrated. And that is, based on a lot of genetic factors that lead us to like set point theory and dual intervention model and all this stuff. But I've had clients lose 50 pounds and get to maintenance calories where they maintain their weight for 6 months, a year, and they are still reporting high amounts of hunger, or higher than you would expect for somebody who's technically at maintenance calories or eating enough for their body to, not gain or lose weight. It's enough for their body, quote unquote. And so I would just acknowledge that to some degree. Like I've been 175 and I've been 225. And I have been at maintenance calories at both of those body weights, and I feel drastically different. I mean, at 175, I can maintain that if I eat X amount of calories, but I can't keep eating X amount of calories because I'm just on a net balance way hungrier than that. And so in a free living scenario, I will naturally end up we think we are autonomous beings, but on some point, you're going to eat as much as you are hungry on average. And so that, if we're talking about moderate amounts of weight loss, that tends to not happen so much. But if you really lose a lot of weight, then I would at least, I don't want to set people up for like some, I can't do anything about this. But I think that there's at least some form of acceptance there as well.
No, I think that's a realistic point of view. I think that a very large regulator of hunger hormones is our body fat cells. And when those are largely shrunken down, there's different hunger hormones that will fluctuate that will cause you to be more hungry, even if you are eating enough calories. So if you get lean enough, there is both a component of eating more calories and increasing body fat to some degree to get to a more sustainable level. Now, if someone just comes from like 20% down to 13%, will they necessarily be below kind of their settling point in which they feel good and they like have normal energy throughout the day? They're not food focused. Their training's going well. Maybe not. But there's definitely some genetics at play here in which some people, they just feel far better when they hang around at like 15, 16% body fat compared to having more shredded abs year round. So I think that isn't necessarily like a poor frame of mind to have on it, but I think it's realistic. And I think that most people, if they build enough muscle, can still get to the physique they want to have. But there might be some of that acknowledgement of it might not just be quite as shredded as they're hoping.
Yeah, that's fair. I think if your goal is to be fit and strong and healthy and get all the benefits of exercise and live a long, healthy life, then I think you can do all of that. But I think for some people that won't be you won't feel your best as lean as you thought sometimes. Even if you're being somewhat realistic, some people are going to find 12% not near. And we talk about set point, which is a super fun chat. It is a combination of genetics and lifestyle. So you might, it's not just genetics. So you might be 15% and you feel awesome, and 12% you don't feel good, or 10%, let's say. And you're like, well, yep, that's my genetics. It's like, yeah, it's your genetics, but it's also the fact that you live a certain lifestyle that makes the type of lifestyle that you would need to make 10% sustainable, not sustainable. And so it's certainly a bit of both, which is why dual intervention model is just like an interesting aggregate of those two things. But yeah, I don't want to, again, it's not like weight loss and weight maintenance is impossible. It's not impossible. Just keeping a lid on like the expectations of like how easy it's going to be just because you're at maintenance now. I still think it's important. Like I'll still ask my clients who are at maintenance, like how they're feeling, because I don't want to assume just because your weight isn't changing that you feel freaking awesome here. And so I think that's at least something I would keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually heard on a podcast this morning, it was Spencer Nadolsky. He was talking about obesity, and he talked about how genetics tend to load the gun and your environment pulls the trigger. So it's this combination of these two different factors, and I think it's a realistic approach to consider both of them. So to me, it sounds like some of the biggest mistakes that you mentioned are having unrealistic expectations of how lean someone can maintain and still feel healthy. Also, sometimes people come back to like their previous maintenance calories right after a deficit, and though they don't realize that those maintenance calories have changed throughout their deficit. Was there anything else there that people kind of mistakenly do following a diet?
Potentially just assuming you're going to maintain all the weight that you lost, definitely. And the mistakes people make that after the diet are just quite often the same ones they were making the whole time during and before, which was like trying to sustain something that they knew inherently wasn't sustainable. Like, is it physiologically possible you could go keto, lose a bunch of weight, and then transition to a more balanced macronutrient intake and maintain your weight? Of course, totally possible. Just highly unlikely.
Well, I think that is a good place to wrap it. If people listen to this, Jordan, they're like, wow, this guy knows his shit. I want to get more of his stuff. Where can they find you? I know you have a podcast where optimal meets practical, but go ahead and plug away.
and we got to get you back on there. Let's before we sign off or after we hit record, let's get you back on there. So yeah, so I have a podcast where Optimal Makes Practical. Ryan was one of my first guests ever, a couple of years ago, and yeah, definitely, you were certainly my first repeat guest. And so definitely, let's get you back on there. Let's see. I really actually excited for that because just we've both been. I've been having a lot of like repeat guests on from the past like years where like we've both been exposed. The last couple of years have been some crazy changes in this whole field, and I kind of learned a lot from you and from Revive Stronger and from RP. And there's since been just like a ton of new information and good, and whether we agree 100% or not would be a good discussion. So yeah, anyway, you can find me on Instagram at Jordan Lips Fitness, website jordanlipsfitness.com. You can find all my stuff. So I appreciate that.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, Jordan.
Thanks, bro.